You think a recording makes you safe? It makes you a liability, Alistair Sterling snarled, pinning Elara against her office door just days before her wedding. She refused to be silenced, but the price was her life. On her wedding night, a black SUV rammed the newlyweds into a ravine. They weren't just murdered, they were erased. 27 years later, a shovel struck a buried roof, and as the trunk was pried open, the world saw the horrific cost of Elara's bravery. The bodies were there, but the evidence she died for was still waiting to scream. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The sun over the Arizona desert doesn't just shine, it punishes. It's a dry, relentless weight that turns everything into a shade of rusted orange. In the summer of 2025, a land clearing crew was working 30 miles outside of Phoenix, preparing the ground for a luxury golf resort that promised to bring green grass to a place that had only ever known dust. Tommy Miller was operating a 20-ton excavator, the cab of his machine smelling of stale coffee and diesel fumes. He was a man who lived by the rhythm of the earth, and he knew exactly how a bucket should feel when it hit rock or compacted silt. Around 2 p.m. the machine didn't crunch, it groaned. Tommy felt a vibration through the joysticks that set his teeth on edge. He stopped the engine, the sudden silence of the desert ringing in his ears like a physical blow. He climbed down, his boots kicking up clouds of fine red powder that tasted like copper. He walked to the edge of the trench and peered down. There, gleaming under a quarter-century of grit, was a sliver of white metal. It wasn't a rock. It was the roof of a car. Tommy didn't know it yet, but he had just reached into 1998 and pulled out a nightmare. He called his supervisor over, a man named Henderson who had spent 30 years looking at dirt and never seen anything worth a second glance. Henderson squinted against the glare, wiping sweat from the back of his neck with a stained bandana. He saw the way the earth had been mounted over the vehicle, a deliberate pile that didn't match the natural flow of the ravine. This wasn't a car that had drifted off the road in a storm. This was a car that had been tucked into the earth like a secret. Detective Elias Thorne arrived 2 hours later. He was 55, with eyes that looked like they had been scrubbed raw by too many crime scenes. He stood at the edge of the pit while the forensics team used brushes and small shovels to clear away the desert skin. Slowly, a 1998 white sedan began to emerge. The tires were flat, the rubber cracked and brittle, but the license plate was still there, hanging by a single rusted bolt. Thorne watched as a tech called out the numbers. He didn't need a computer to tell him who it belonged to. He had been a rookie when the Vance case went cold, and he still remembered the faces of the couple on the missing person posters. Elara and Julian Vance. The newlyweds who vanished after their wedding reception. They were young, beautiful, and full of the kind of hope that makes a disappearance feel like a personal insult to the community. Thorne felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He watched as the techs moved toward the back of the car. The trunk lid was seized shut, the metal fused by years of heat and oxidation. It took a crowbar and 3 men to force it open. When the hinges finally gave way with a shriek of tortured metal, the smell hit them, a dry, musty scent of old fabric and something much darker. Inside, they didn't find luggage. They didn't find honeymoon tickets or maps to the coast. They found 2 sets of remains, huddled together in the darkness. The white fabric of Elara's wedding dress had turned the color of bone, the lace fragile as a moth's wing. Julian was beside her, his arms still positioned as if he were trying to shield her from whatever had happened in the moments before the light went out. Thorne turned away, staring out at the vast, empty horizon. The desert had finally given up its dead, but it wasn't an accident. He saw the small, clean holes in the back of the skulls. This was an execution. Back at the station, the air conditioning hummed, a sharp contrast to the baking heat of the site. Thorne sat at his desk, surrounded by files that were older than some of the officers in the building. The original report from September 19, 1998, was thin. It talked about a last scene at the Phoenician resort at 10 p.m. It talked about a couple driving toward Sky Harbor Airport for a midnight flight to Maui. They never checked in. Their credit cards never saw another swipe. Their families spent weeks, then months, then decades looking at the phone, waiting for a ring that never came. The forensic report arrived on Thorne's screen an hour later. Dr. Eris, the medical examiner, confirmed the cause of death. Single gunshot wounds to the head from a small caliber weapon, likely a .22. But there was a detail that made Thorne sit up straighter. The bodies didn't have any sand or desert grit in their lungs. They hadn't been killed at the burial site. They had been killed somewhere else, somewhere clean, and then transported to the ravine. There were also fibers found on the hem of the wedding dress, industrial blue carpet fibers that didn't match the car's interior or anything found in a typical home. They were the kind of fibers used in high-traffic office buildings or warehouses. Thorne tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythm mimicking a heartbeat. This wasn't a carjacking gone wrong. A carjacker doesn't take the time to drive 30 miles into the wilderness, dig a hole large enough for a sedan, and bury the evidence with such care. This was a cleanup. This was someone protecting a reputation. By the time the sun began to set, the news had leaked. The helicopters were circling the construction site, their lights flickering like angry insects against the darkening sky. Thorne knew he had to move fast. He had a primary crime scene to find, a weapon to track, and a motive that had been simmering for 27 years. He looked at the guest list from the wedding, his eyes landing on the name of the man who had given Elara her start in the corporate world, Alistair Sterling. In 1998, he was a middle manager with an ego the size of the valley. Now he was a billionaire with his name on the side of skyscrapers. Thorne remembered the gossip from back then, whispers of Sterling's difficult personality and his wandering eyes. He wondered if Elara Vance had seen something she wasn't supposed to, or if she had simply said no to a man who didn't understand the word. He grabbed his jacket, the weight of the case pressing down on his shoulders. The desert had done its part. It had preserved the truth until someone was ready to listen. Now it was Thorne's turn to make sure that whoever put those kids in that trunk didn't get to spend another night in a comfortable bed. Maya Vance sat in her Scottsdale kitchen, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound in a house that suddenly felt far too large. She was 50 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, a physical map of the years she had spent looking toward the horizon. When the phone rang, she didn't jump. She had been expecting this call for 27 years, a phantom vibration she felt in her bones every time a new skeleton was found in the hills or a car was pulled from a canal. Maya Vance, this is Detective Elias Thorne. The voice was heavy, gravelly, and carried the kind of practiced gentleness that only comes from delivering the worst news of a person's life. Maya didn't ask if they had found her brother. She didn't ask if he was okay. She simply closed her eyes and felt a strange, cold relief wash over her. The not knowing was a fire that had burned her down to ash. The truth, no matter how jagged, was the water that finally put it out. "You found the car," she said, her voice a steady whisper that betrayed none of the shaking in her hands. "We did," Thorne replied. "I need you to come down to the station. There are things we need to discuss that shouldn't happen over a landline." The drive to the Phoenix Police Department was a blur of heat shimmer and desert landscape. Maya kept seeing 1998. She kept seeing Elara in that dress, a cloud of silk and lace that seemed too bright for a world this dusty. She remembered the way Julian had looked at his bride, his eyes full of a terrifyingly pure devotion. They were supposed to be the lucky ones. They had the degrees, the high-paying jobs, and a love that made other people feel like they were just playing house. In the small, windowless interview room, the air felt thick with the scent of old paper and industrial cleaner. Thorne sat across from her, pushing a manila folder toward her, but keeping his hand on it, a protective gesture. "Maya, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you've earned that much. We found them in the trunk. It wasn't an accident. They were shot, execution style, before the car was ever put in the ground." Maya didn't sob. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on a coffee stain on the table. "Elara knew," she said quietly. The night of the wedding, she wasn't herself. She was laughing, but it didn't reach her eyes. She kept checking her bridle clutch, clutching it like a lifeline. Thorne leaned forward, his chair creaking. Did she say why? Was there someone at the wedding she was afraid of? No, she said it was a work thing, Maya whispered. She had been working late for weeks at Sterling and Associates. She told me her boss, Alistair Sterling, had been mentoring her, but her face would go tight every time his name came up. She mentioned a meeting she had to take on the way to the airport. Something about an emergency signature for a new account. Julian hated it. He wanted to just go, to leave the city behind, but Elara was always so responsible. She didn't want to leave a mess behind. Thorne made a note, the scratch of his pen loud in the silence. Alistair Sterling. In the late 90s, Sterling was the golden boy of Phoenix marketing, a man who treated the city like his private playground. Maya remembered him at the reception. He had shown up late, smelling of expensive scotch and arrogance. He had cornered Elara near the buffet, his hand lingering a second too long on her waist. Maya had seen Julian step in, his jaw set, moving his wife away with a quiet, firm politeness that Sterling had clearly found insulting. She had a tape, Maya added suddenly, the memory surfacing like a bubble of air. A small microcassette. She showed it to me in the bathroom while she was changing into her travel clothes. She said, "If anything happens, look in my old desk at the house." I thought she was joking. I thought she was just being dramatic about a promotion dispute. Thorne's eyes sharpened. "Did you ever look?" "I couldn't," Maya said, her voice breaking for the first time. After they vanished, the police searched the house, but they were looking for signs of a struggle or a suitcase. They weren't looking for a hidden tape. And then the bank foreclosed, and the house was gone. I forgot until right now. The injustice of it hit Thorne like a physical weight. A young woman, terrified and brave, had tried to leave a breadcrumb trail, and the world had simply swept it away. He thought of Sterling's current life, the gala photos, the handshakes with the governor, the millions of dollars donated to family values charities. If Sterling had killed those kids to keep a secret, he had spent the last 27 years winning. Thorne walked Maya to her car, the Arizona sun beginning to dip below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. "We're going to find that tape, Maya," he promised, "and we're going to find out what was so important that it was worth 2 lives." As Maya drove away, she looked in her rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw the ghost of the white sedan following her, the headlights dim and dusty. She realized then that the desert hadn't just preserved the bodies. It had preserved the anger. The city had moved on, built skyscrapers and malls over the old roads, but under the surface the truth was still there, waiting for someone to finally give it a voice. Maya went home and didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark and remembered the way Elara had hugged her goodbye at the resort. "I'll call you from Maui," she had whispered. Maya was still waiting for that call, but for the first time in nearly 3 decades, she felt like she might finally be able to hang up the phone. The headquarters of Sterling Global sat like a glass fortress in the heart of North Scottsdale, its mirrored surface reflecting the desert sky so perfectly it was almost invisible. Detective Elias Thorne felt the familiar itch of irritation as he sat in the lobby, surrounded by minimalist chrome furniture and abstract art that cost more than his annual pension. He wasn't there for the view. He was there to look into the eyes of a man who had successfully erased a partner and a protege from his history. Alistair Sterling didn't make him wait long, but the gesture was calculated. Exactly 20 minutes of silence to remind Thorne who held the power in this zip code. When the assistant finally led Thorne down a hallway lined with photos of Sterling shaking hands with world leaders, Thorne noticed the conspicuous absence of any images from the late 90s. It was as if the decade had been scrubbed clean, a digital lobotomy of the company's origins. Sterling stood as Thorne entered, his tailored suit shifting without a single wrinkle. He looked like a man who spent his mornings in a gym and his afternoons in a boardroom, a picture of disciplined success. "Detective, a tragic business," Sterling began, his voice a smooth baritone that sounded like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. "The news about the Vance car has hit the office hard, even after all these years." Thorne didn't sit. He walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had hidden Sterling's secrets for 27 years. "It's funny how the desert works, Alistair," Thorne said, not turning around. "You can bury something deep, but the wind always finds a way to move the dirt. We found Elara and Julian, and we found how they died." The silence in the room sharpened. Thorne turned back to see Sterling's hand grip the edge of his mahogany desk, the knuckles turning white against the dark wood. They were executed, Thorne continued, watching Sterling's eyes. Small caliber, professional. But the killer was sloppy with the cleanup. We found industrial blue carpet fibers on Elara's gown, the kind of carpet Sterling and associates used in their old Tempe warehouse back in '98. Sterling's face remained a mask of professional concern, but a muscle in his jaw betrayed him. Detective, we were a young firm then. Dozens of people had access to that warehouse. If you're suggesting— I'm not suggesting yet, Thorne interrupted. I'm investigating. I've been looking into Elara's HR files, or rather, the lack of them. It seems her personnel records from 1998 went missing shortly after she disappeared. Thorne leaned over the desk, invading Sterling's personal space. I spoke to Elara Vance. She remembers Elara being terrified of you. She remembers a work issue that Elara was going to handle right after the honeymoon. And she remembers a micro-cassette tape. Elara recorded you, didn't she, Alistair? She recorded the harassment. She recorded the threats. Sterling's confidence didn't shatter. It curdled into something colder. Elara was a talented girl, but she was ambitious. Sometimes ambition leads to misunderstandings. If there was a tape, which I doubt, it was likely a fabrication to leverage a better position. Thorne pulled a small evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was a weathered piece of plastic, a micro-cassette recovered from a floorboard in Elara's childhood home, which Maya had helped him locate just hours before. He didn't tell Sterling the tape was currently being restored by the lab and was mostly static. He just let the physical presence of it do the work. The night of the wedding, Elara told her sister she had an emergency meeting at the warehouse, Thorne said quietly. She brought Julian because they were on their way to the airport. They thought they were meeting you for a final signature. But you weren't there to sign a contract, Alistair. You were there to sign their death warrants. Sterling let out a short, dry laugh. I was at a gala that night, Detective. There are photos. There are witnesses. You're reaching into the past to find a monster because the truth, that they were likely victims of a random carjacking, is too boring for you. A carjacker doesn't bury a car 6 feet deep in a ravine 30 miles from the city, Thorne countered. A carjacker doesn't preserve a crime scene for 3 decades. Only a man with everything to lose takes that kind of time. As Thorne walked out of the office, he felt the weight of Sterling's gaze on his back, a physical pressure that felt like a threat. He knew Sterling would be on the phone within minutes, calling the people who helped him clean up the mess in '98. But Thorne had the one thing Sterling couldn't buy. The desert had finally stopped keeping his secrets. He returned to the station to find Officer Jennifer Park waiting for him with a breakthrough. She had been digging through Sterling's old financial records, looking for any connection to professional cleaners. I found a payment, Detective, she said, her eyes bright. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Sterling authorized a consulting fee of $50,000 to a shell company owned by a man named Victor Salazar. Thorne felt the pieces clicking into place. Salazar was a name that appeared in every dark corner of Phoenix history, a man who specialized in making problems go away. If Sterling provided the motive, Salazar provided the means. And Thorne knew exactly where to find him. The Mesa storage facility was a labyrinth of corrugated metal and sun-bleached asphalt, a place where people tucked away the cluttered remains of lives they no longer wanted to lead. Detective Thorne felt a grim sense of destiny as the manager's keys jangled toward Unit 247. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of oil and old metal. They found the gun collection exactly as Thomas had described, a morbid library of violence. In a velvet-lined case, a small .22 caliber pistol sat in an empty slot that had held its shape in the dust for 27 years. Ballistics would later confirm it was the same weapon that had stolen the futures of Elara and Julian Vance. But Victor Salazar was gone. He had seen the police at his dealership and knew the walls were finally closing in. He didn't head for the airport or the border. He drove toward the only place where he felt he still held a shred of control. Thorne received a cell tower ping at 2 a.m. Salazar was heading back to the ravine, back to the shallow grave where he had buried the white sedan in 1998. When Thorne arrived at the construction site, the first light of dawn was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the desert a violent shade of purple. Victor Salazar was standing at the edge of the excavation pit, looking down into the hole where the car had been. He looked small against the vastness of the Arizona sky, a predator who had finally run out of places to hide. "It's over, Victor," Thorne called out, his hand resting on his holster but his voice calm. "We have Thomas, we have the gun, and we have the confession Sterling is about to sign to save his own neck." Salazar didn't turn around. He stayed focused on the scarred earth. "Sterling was a coward," Salazar said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin morning air. "He paid me to solve a problem because he couldn't handle a woman who was smarter than him. I did what I was paid for. In this world, the weak are just fuel for the strong." "You executed 2 kids for a consulting fee," Thorne countered, stepping closer. "And you spent 27 years thinking the desert would keep your secret. But the dirt always moves, Victor. It always moves." Salazar finally looked at Thorne, and for the first time, the detective saw a flicker of something that wasn't arrogance. It was a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. Salazar raised a hand, but he wasn't pointing a weapon at the officers. He was holding a small silver locket, something he had taken from Elara's neck before he closed the trunk in 1998. He dropped it into the pit, a final, useless gesture of return. "I'm not going to a cell, detective," Salazar said quietly. "I've lived on my own terms, and I'll end it the same way." Before anyone could move, a single shot echoed across the valley. Salazar fell into the very earth he had used to hide his crimes, the desert finally demanding its final debt in blood. 3 weeks later, the justice that had been delayed for a generation finally arrived in a North Scottsdale boardroom. Alistair Sterling was led out of his glass fortress in handcuffs, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The news footage of the billionaire being pressed into the back of a patrol car played on a loop across the country, a public shattering of a 27-year lie. Maya Vance stood at the graveside on a Saturday morning, the air smelling of fresh rain and creosote. 2 coffins sat side by side, draped in white lilies. The entire community had gathered. Old friends from 1998, family members who had grown gray waiting for this day, and the construction crew who had accidentally found the truth. "My sister didn't just vanish," Maya told the crowd, her voice echoing with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "She fought. She left us a trail because she believed that the truth mattered more than her own safety. She and Julian were heroes of a story we didn't know how to read." As the coffins were lowered together, Maya felt the weight that had pressed on her chest since she was 23 years old finally lift. She looked at her own daughter, who was now a teacher, just as Elara had dreamed of being. The legacy of the Vance name wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a testament to the fact that no secret is deep enough to stay buried forever. Detective Thorne stood in the back, watching the family find their peace. He thought about the white sedan and the industrial blue carpet, and the way a microcassette tape had survived nearly 3 decades of silence. He realized then that the desert wasn't just a graveyard, it was a witness. And as long as there were people willing to listen, the truth would always find its way home. The Phoenix night was warm and clear as Thorne drove back to the station. Above him, the stars were brilliant and constant, the same stars that had watched over a young couple in 1998. The case was closed, the file was stamped, and for the first time in 27 years, the desert was finally quiet. The desert is a patient storyteller. It doesn't care about your money, your status, or how deep you dig your holes. It only cares about the truth. Alistair Sterling thought he could buy his way out of a crime, but he forgot that justice has no expiration date. Elara and Julian Vance finally have their names back. If you believe that every secret eventually finds the light, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We tell the stories that time tried to erase. Until next time, remember, the truth is always worth the wait. If you believe that no amount of power can bury the truth forever, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. We uncover the stories the world tried to forget, from the deepest desert graves to the highest corner offices. Don't let these voices stay silenced. Join our community and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Disclaimer: this program is for entertainment purposes only. While inspired by real cold cases and historical investigation patterns, the names, characters, and specific narrative events in this script have been fictionalized for dramatic effect. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The forensic techniques and legal procedures depicted are intended for storytelling and should not be used as a substitute for professional legal or investigative advice.